October 23, 2023. For 17 in the morning, the Coast Guard Dispatch Center receives an automated distress beacon from 12 nautical miles off the Al-Zahara coastline. The signal originates from a luxury yacht registered as Desert Rose, owned by one of the region's wealthiest families. Within 18 minutes, the first responder helicopter hovers above the vessel, searchlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness. What they find stops them cold. 3 bodies, different locations, different causes of death. Blood mixed with seawater on pristine white decks. A scene of such chaos it's impossible to determine where the violence started and where it ended. The yacht belongs to Sheikh Rafiq Al-Malik, a billionaire real estate magnate. But he's not the only victim. His daughter lies in the water below, weighted down by evidence she died trying to preserve. His son-in-law floats face down nearby, a bullet in his chest and his skull fractured. And the Sheikh's American wife? She's already been airlifted to Royal Medical Center, fighting for her life in an operating room where doctors are losing the battle. By sunrise, all 4 will be dead. This isn't a story about strangers. This is about family, about a marriage built on a contract instead of love, about an affair that became a conspiracy, about greed disguised as need, and desperation that turned ordinary people into killers. How does a luxury evening cruise end with 4 corpses? The answer is buried in text messages, prenuptial agreements, and the dangerous belief that murder can be controlled. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear proves that sometimes the real danger doesn't come from strangers in foreign waters. It comes from the people sharing your bed. Before she was a suspect in a murder conspiracy, before she married into billions, before she ever heard the name Al-Malik, Melissa Harper was just another American woman trying to escape the slow suffocation of debt. Born April 3, 1987, in Riverside Heights, a mid-sized American city where ambition outpaced opportunity, Melissa grew up watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep their apartment. Waitress in the morning, retail clerk in the afternoon, hotel night desk on weekends. Her mother's hands were always dry from industrial soap, her eyes always tired from shift work that never ended. Melissa made a promise to herself at 14 years old, folding donated clothes in their bedroom while her mother slept after a double shift. I will never struggle like this. Whatever it takes. She kept that promise. But whatever it takes has a price nobody sees until the bill comes due. By 2019, Melissa was 32 and living the life she'd engineered with precision. Executive assistant at Bennett & Associates, a mid-level consulting firm. She pulled in $58,000 a year, enough to rent a 1-bedroom in Riverside Heights business district and lease a BMW she couldn't quite afford. Her appearance was immaculate, auburn hair highlighted every 6 weeks, designer work clothes purchased on credit, makeup applied with the skill of someone who understood that beauty was currency in professional spaces. But beneath the polished surface, the math wasn't working. $47,000 in student loans from Riverside State University. $8,300 in credit card debt from maintaining the image of success. Rent eating up 30% of her take-home pay. Car payment draining another $450 monthly. The BMW lease was a calculated risk, clients noticed what you drove, and looking successful meant being treated as successful. Melissa wasn't drowning. She was treading water in the middle of the ocean, exhausted, knowing she could keep going for years but never reach shore. She dated occasionally, professional men with comfortable salaries and careful retirement plans. They talked about saving for down payments and realistic timelines for marriage. They were nice, stable, and every conversation with them felt like accepting that this was it. This careful, calculated climb toward modest security was all she could expect. Then September 15, 2019, changed everything. The Riverside Heights Convention Center was hosting the Global Investment Forum, one of those international business conferences that brought money from everywhere to a city desperate to be taken seriously. Melissa's firm had purchased a table, and she'd been assigned to manage logistics for their VIP clients. The unglamorous work of ensuring powerful people never had to think about details. It was 3:47 in the afternoon when she first saw Sheikh Rafiq Al-Malik across the networking reception. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, holding a glass of sparkling water while a cluster of anxious business executives competed for his attention. 6'1", salt and pepper beard trimmed with precision, wearing a custom-tailored Brioni suit that probably cost more than Melissa's car. But it wasn't the obvious wealth that caught her attention, it was his stillness. While everyone around him performed ambition, he simply existed, comfortable in his own gravity. Melissa had learned early that opportunity doesn't knock. You manufacture the encounter and make it look accidental. She walked past his group carrying a leather portfolio, timed her steps perfectly, and stumbled just enough for her papers to scatter near his feet. Not obvious, just clumsy enough to be believable. Sheikh Rafiq knelt to help before his assistants could move. His hands gathered her documents with unexpected care, and when he looked up at her, his expression held genuine warmth rather than the calculating assessment she'd grown used to from wealthy men. "These appear important," he said, his English perfect but accented. "I hope nothing is damaged." Their first conversation lasted 11 minutes. She thanked him, he asked about her work. She mentioned the challenges of coordinating international business events. He shared an anecdote about a conference disaster in Singapore. The content was forgettable. The connection wasn't. When he asked for her business card, she saw something in his eyes she recognized because she felt it too, loneliness that money couldn't solve. Sheikh Rafiq Al-Malik was 54 years old, widower since 2014 when his wife Fatima died from cancer. His business empire, Al-Malik Holdings, was worth an estimated $1.8 billion, real estate developments, shipping contracts, technology investments across 3 continents. He had one daughter, Amira, 26 years old and already groomed to eventually take over the family business. He lived in Al-Zahara, a coastal city known for luxury and traditional values in equal measure. And he was tired of business dinners where people wanted access rather than conversation. Tired of being a symbol rather than a person. Tired of going home to empty penthouses filled with memories of a woman he'd loved and lost. Over the next 3 weeks, they talked. Phone calls that started as professional courtesy and evolved into something neither had planned. He called her from Dubai at midnight his time, early evening hers, and they'd talk for 2 hours about art, about ambition, about the loneliness of cities full of people. She learned he collected contemporary art and funded scholarships for architecture students. He learned she'd minored in art history and still visited museums on Sunday mornings when admission was free. On October 3, 2019, he flew back to Riverside Heights for what his calendar called business meetings but what was really an excuse to take Melissa to dinner. The Riverside Grill, a restaurant where the prix-fixe menu cost $480 per person. She wore a black dress she'd bought specifically for this evening, spending money she didn't have on the possibility of a future where money wouldn't matter. He didn't propose that night. He was traditional enough to believe in proper courtship, and she was strategic enough to let him set the pace. But over dessert, he said something that revealed how clearly he saw through her carefully constructed image. "You work very hard to appear comfortable. I recognize this because I spent my 20s doing the same thing. The difference is, I no longer have to pretend." She could have been offended. Instead, she was relieved. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there." He set down his wine glass and met her eyes. "I'm not looking for someone who needs rescuing, Melissa. But I am looking for someone who understands that security and companionship can be chosen deliberately rather than stumbled into by accident." It was the most honest proposal she'd ever received, even though it wasn't technically a proposal yet. He was offering her a transaction dressed in kindness. She was considering accepting it dressed as affection. Neither was lying exactly. They were just being pragmatic about the intersection of need and availability. By November, they were seeing each other every week, him flying to Riverside Heights or her meeting him in New York, Chicago, wherever his business took him. He introduced her via video call to Amira, who was polite in the way people are when they're too well-bred to show disapproval but can't quite hide the tension around their eyes. Amira lived in Al-Zahara, worked as VP of Trust Management at her father's company, and clearly had opinions about her father dating an American woman half his age. December 12, 2019. Sheikh Rafiq took Melissa to the Riverside Museum of Art on a Sunday morning when it was nearly empty. They stood in front of a painting by a local artist, abstract, all blues and grays that could have been ocean or sky or the space between intention and action. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black box. "I'm 54 years old," he said quietly. "I've been married before, and I loved my wife very much. I cannot promise you the same kind of love because that was specific to who we were together. But I can promise you security, respect, and genuine affection. I would like you to be my wife, Melissa Harper. Not because I need someone to manage my household or look beautiful at events, though you do both excellently, but because in 3 months, You've made me feel less alone than I've felt in 5 years. The ring was a 4-carat diamond that cost $87,000. The proposal was honest about its limitations. And Melissa, standing in a free museum in a city where she'd never stopped feeling like she was one bad month away from financial disaster, said yes. She told herself it was practical. She told herself older couples built successful marriages on less. She told herself that growing to love someone was more realistic than the fairy tale version anyway. All of this was true. What she didn't tell herself was that marrying for security while calling it something else would create a foundation that couldn't support the weight of future decisions. 3 weeks later, she was sitting in a law office in Al-Zahara, staring at 47 pages of prenuptial agreement that spelled out exactly what their marriage would mean in legal terms. The attorney, Abbas Khalil, was thorough to the point of tedium, walking her through every clause with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved contract law. The terms were clear. She'd receive $50,000 monthly for household expenses, an amount that made her mother's lifetime earnings look like pocket change. She'd live in the penthouse of Al-Zahara Towers, worth $4.2 million. She'd have a personal car, a full household staff, unlimited allowance for clothing and beauty maintenance. If Sheikh Rafiq died while they were married, she'd inherit $15 million immediately, plus a 20% stake in Al-Malik Holdings worth approximately $360 million. But here was the catch, printed in the same calm font as everything else. If Melissa initiated divorce, she'd receive nothing. 0. If she was caught in infidelity, she'd receive nothing and be deported. If she stayed married for 10 years, she'd receive $5 million regardless of who initiated divorce. And all major financial decisions from her inheritance, anything over $100,000, would require approval from Amira Al-Malik, who controlled her father's trust. Abbas Khalil slid the pen across the desk. This agreement protects the family legacy, Mrs. Harper. Please read everything carefully before signing. Sheikh Rafiq sat beside her, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. This is merely formality, Habibti. I take care of those I love. You'll never want for anything. Melissa picked up the pen. It hovered over the signature line for 47 seconds while she did the math in her head. 10 years equaled $5 million equaled freedom at 42 instead of 62. She could do 10 years. People endured worse for less. What she didn't calculate was how long 10 years would feel when measured in days of isolation, or how a gilded cage would feel different from freedom even when the bars were made of platinum. She signed on January 8, 2020, and later, investigators would note how her handwriting changed between the first page and the last, confident to uncertain, bold to hesitant, as if her hand understood what her mind refused to acknowledge. They married on February 14, 2020. Valentine's Day was Melissa's choice, a touch of American romance grafted onto a union that was more merger than love story. The Majestic Palace Hotel in Al-Zahara hosted 280 guests, mostly his family and business associates. Melissa's side of the venue looked sparse. Her mother, 2 friends from college, and a cousin who'd agreed to fly out for free accommodation at a luxury hotel. The wedding cost $340,000. Melissa's Vera Wang gown, at $12,000, was deemed too revealing by family elders, and she had to change into a more conservative dress for the actual ceremony. Her mother whispered during the reception, "Are you sure about this, honey?" And Melissa, surrounded by more wealth than she'd ever imagined, champagne in hand and diamond ring catching the light, answered with certainty she'd later regret, "I've never been more sure of anything." The honeymoon was 12 days at a private resort in the Azura Islands. $78,000 for an experience that should have been perfect but felt like dress rehearsal for a play she hadn't fully memorized. They had their first real argument on day 7, when Melissa posted bikini photos to her social media and Sheikh Rafiq quietly asked her to delete them. Not demanded, asked, but the request carried the weight of expectation, of cultural differences she hadn't fully considered, of the reality that her life was no longer entirely her own. She deleted the photos. She told herself it was respect for his culture. But late at night, lying beside a man who was kind but felt like a stranger, she wrote in her journal, "Paradise has a price. I'm learning it's paid in small freedoms." March 2020. Melissa moved into the penthouse at Al-Zahara Towers, 42nd floor, 6,800 square feet of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic views of the ocean. The staff was waiting. Nadia the chef, Yasmin the housekeeper, Omar the driver, Layla the personal assistant, plus a gardener and security. 6 people whose job was to ensure she never had to think about the mechanics of daily life. The routine established itself quickly. Sheikh Rafiq left for Al-Malik Holdings headquarters at 8:30 each morning. Melissa woke to breakfast already prepared, her schedule already organized by Layla, her day already structured by obligations she hadn't chosen. Charity luncheons with other wealthy wives who spoke in Arabic she couldn't follow. Shopping trips to boutiques where staff knew her by name but not as a person. Spa appointments that filled time but not the growing void. She tried learning Arabic, gave up after 3 weeks when the grammar felt insurmountable and the motivation felt artificial. She tried making friends, but the other women in her social circle were polite rather than warm, including her in events while never quite accepting her as one of them. She was the American wife, the young second marriage, the woman who'd obviously married for money even though everyone was too polite to say it directly. By September 2020, 6 months into her marriage, Melissa was living a life that looked perfect in photographs and felt suffocating in reality. The $50,000 monthly allowance disappeared faster than she'd imagined. $12,000 on designer clothes to fit her new social position, $8,000 on jewelry for events, $3,000 on beauty maintenance, $7,000 on gifts to maintain relationships with people she didn't particularly like. The remainder she tried to save, but lifestyle inflation was real and insidious. And Sheikh Rashid, while kind, was absent in ways that money couldn't compensate for. He worked 12-hour days. When he came home, he was tired, distracted, more father figure than husband. Their age gap, 22 years, became more apparent with time. He'd lived an entire life before meeting her. She was living her first life with someone who'd already completed that journey. The penthouse was full of photographs of his first wife, Fatima. Beautiful silver frames on every surface, showing a woman who'd understood his world because she'd been born into it. Melissa couldn't remove them. They were part of his history, his grief, his identity. But living among them felt like being compared to a ghost she'd never measure up to. One night in late September, after a particularly stilted dinner where they'd run out of conversation by the appetizer course, Sheikh Rafiq said something that cut deeper than he probably intended. Fatima understood our ways. She was patient with the learning. Melissa heard the unspoken comparison. You're not patient enough. You're not trying hard enough. You're not her. October 12, 2020. Sheikh Rashid's 55th birthday. The penthouse filled with family for an evening celebration. 18 relatives including his daughter Amira and her husband. Melissa played hostess with practiced grace, ensuring drinks stayed filled and conversation flowed, performing the role she'd been hired to play. That's when she met Tariq Al-Mansouri for the first time, though met isn't quite accurate. She'd known he existed, Amira's husband, the architect, the man who'd married into the Al-Malik family 2 years before Melissa had. But she'd never really looked at him until that evening when they were seated across from each other at dinner. Tariq Hassan Al-Mansouri was 30 years old, born June 22, 1990. He had dark wavy hair that fell slightly over his forehead, brown eyes that held sadness even when he smiled, and an athletic build that suggested he actually used the gym membership most wealthy men paid for but ignored. He worked as an architect at Sterling and Cross design firm, pulling in $85,000 a year, comfortable by normal standards, poverty by the standards of the family he'd married into. His marriage to Amira had been arranged. Not forced, but negotiated between families when he was 26 and she was 24. The Al-Mansouri family was successful but not elite. The Al-Malik family was elite but needed appropriate husbands for their daughters, men who were educated, professional, and willing to accept that marrying Amira meant accepting a certain loss of independence. They'd had 2 years of chaperoned courtship before the wedding in June 2018. Formal dinners, family gatherings, conversations about values and expectations, but never about whether they actually liked each other as people. The wedding was beautiful. The marriage was polite. And by the time Melissa met him, Tariq and Amira had been sleeping in separate bedrooms for 18 months. During dinner, Melissa mentioned wanting to redesign her wing of the penthouse, something to make the space feel more like hers and less like a museum she was visiting. Tariq, being an architect, offered professional advice about maximizing natural light and creating intimate spaces within large rooms. The conversation was innocuous, but when he said, "Sometimes you need spaces that feel like freedom, even when you're surrounded by walls," their eyes met and held for 3 seconds longer than necessary. Amira noticed. She was seated at the opposite end of the table with her father, but she saw the extended eye contact, the way Melissa leaned slightly forward when Tariq spoke, the micro-expression of recognition that passed between two people who suddenly realized they understood each other. 2 days later, October 14th at 11:43 p.m., Melissa's phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "I've been thinking about your redesign. Coffee to discuss." It was signed Tariq, followed by a professional courtesy. "Amira suggested I help since this is what I do." Melissa stared at the message for 23 minutes before responding. She knew what this was. Not a professional consultation, an excuse, a test, a first step toward something that would either be nothing or everything, but definitely not what it pretended to be. She typed back, "Thursday, 2 p.m., Harbor Cafe?" His response came in seconds, "See you there." Neither of them was stupid. Neither was naive. They both knew that accepting this coffee meeting meant choosing a path that didn't lead anywhere good. But they were both so desperately lonely, so profoundly trapped in marriages that were contracts rather than partnerships, that the promise of being seen as an actual person felt worth any risk. Thursday, October 18th, 2 p.m. Harbor Cafe sat along the Al-Zahara Marina, all floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick, the kind of place where wealthy people went to feel artistic. Melissa arrived first, ordered sparkling water, and waited with her heart beating faster than coffee warranted. Tariq walked in at 2:03 p.m. wearing jeans and a casual button-down, the first time she'd seen him out of formal family dinner attire. He looked younger, less weighed down by expectation. They ordered coffee neither of them wanted and pretended to discuss interior design for approximately 11 minutes before the conversation shifted to what it had always been about. "How do you do it?" Melissa asked quietly. "The pretending?" Tariq stirred sugar into coffee he wouldn't drink. "I remind myself that this is temporary. That eventually I'll be old enough that people will stop expecting things from me." "How old is that?" "I don't know. Maybe dead." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I married a woman I respect but don't love. I'm 30 years old and I feel 60. I design beautiful spaces for other people and go home to a house that feels like a waiting room." Melissa recognized the feeling so precisely it hurt. "I married security and lost myself in the transaction." They talked for 3.5 hours. The coffee went cold. The lunch crowd came and went. The staff started setting tables for dinner service. And in that stretch of afternoon that neither had planned to spend together, they built a foundation of shared misery that would eventually support terrible decisions. They didn't touch. They didn't exchange anything inappropriate. But something deeper than physical attraction passed between them, the recognition that someone else understood the specific loneliness of living in luxury while feeling trapped. When they finally left the cafe at 5:47 p.m., Tariq said, "This was helpful for the design consultation. Thank you." Melissa understood the subtext. "Yes, very professional. Thank you." They texted that night. 47 messages exchanged between October 18th and October 31st. By November, that number climbed to 312. By December, 578. The content started professional, design suggestions, color palettes, furniture recommendations. Then friendly, shared articles, funny observations, complaints about family obligations. Then intimate confessions about unhappiness, admissions of attraction, dangerous hypotheticals about what if. November 3rd, their second meeting. The Galleria Mall under the pretense of furniture shopping. They walked through showrooms touching leather sofas and testing chair comfort, performing normalcy while everything about their body language screamed that this wasn't about furniture. In an elevator between floors, their hands brushed accidentally. Neither pulled away. The electricity between them was undeniable, and they both felt it while pretending not to notice. November 28th, an art gallery opening for a friend of Tariq's. Public setting, anonymous in the crowd, his hand on her lower back guiding her through the space. She leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. They stayed for 4 hours, then texted for 3 more after leaving separately. December 15th. This was the crossing point, the moment when emotional affair became physical betrayal. Tariq's architectural firm, after hours, under the pretext of reviewing penthouse redesign sketches. The office was empty, just the two of them surrounded by blueprints and the last rays of evening light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. The kiss happened at 7:43 p.m., though neither of them could later say who initiated it. One moment they were discussing spatial flow, the next they were against his desk, blueprints scattering to the floor, months of loneliness and attraction finally given permission to exist. What followed was inevitable and catastrophic. They stayed in that office until 2:17 a.m., alternating between physical intimacy and emotional confession, building a connection that felt more real than either of their actual marriages. Afterward, they sat on the floor of his office, backs against the desk, and made promises they both knew they'd break. "This can't happen again," Melissa said. "I know," Tariq agreed. It happened again 5 days later, and 5 days after that, and soon they stopped pretending they were going to stop. By January 2021, Melissa and Tariq had established a routine that required the kind of logistics usually reserved for espionage. Tuesday afternoons belonged to them, 2 to 5 p.m. at the Sapphire Hotel, room 308, registered under the name Sarah Mitchell. The room cost $240 per visit, charged to a credit card Melissa had opened secretly, separate from the accounts Sheikh Rafiq monitored. 18 visits between January and May, documented later through bank records that would become evidence. They also rented a seaside cottage at Crescent Beach, 40 minutes north of Al-Zahara, for weekend getaways once a month. $800 per weekend. Melissa's alibi was spa retreats with friends she didn't actually have. Tariq's was site visits for architectural projects that didn't require weekend work. The lies came easier with practice, which should have alarmed them but instead just felt necessary. But the affair wasn't just physical desperation. It was emotional salvation. Tariq was the first person in Melissa's new life who asked what she wanted instead of telling her what was expected. She was the first person in years who saw Tariq as something other than an acquisition made by his in-laws. They talked for hours about futures that didn't include the people they'd married, fantasies of different lives in different cities where they could simply be two people who'd chosen each other. "What would you do if you could start over?" Melissa asked one afternoon in February, lying in rumpled hotel sheets with afternoon light cutting across the bed. Tariq traced patterns on her shoulder. "Design houses for normal people. Work reasonable hours. Come home to someone who actually wanted me there. You. Open a small art gallery. Nothing major. Just a space where local artists could show work. Live in an apartment I could actually afford without feeling like I was failing." She laughed, but there was pain in it. "Funny how all our dreams involve having less money but more freedom." "Money doesn't buy freedom when it comes with conditions," Tariq said quietly. "It just buys a more comfortable prison." They understood each other perfectly. That understanding made them feel justified in what they were doing, as if emotional compatibility somehow negated the betrayal. But beneath the rationalization, both felt the weight of what they'd become. Cheaters, liars, people who traded integrity for afternoon escapes. The guilt manifested differently in each of them. Melissa threw herself into being the perfect wife during the hours she wasn't with Tariq, as if performing her role flawlessly would somehow balance the moral ledger. She attended every charity event, smiled for every photograph, never complained about the isolation or the cultural barriers. Sheikh Rafiq noticed her increased effort and interpreted it as finally adjusting to married life. "You seem happier lately, Habibti," he said one evening over dinner. "I'm glad you're finding your place here." The irony of that statement, that her happiness came from betraying him, sat heavy in Melissa's chest. She smiled and thanked him and hated herself just a little more. Tariq's guilt drove him deeper into work, accepting projects he didn't have time for, staying late at the office even when he wasn't meeting Melissa. Amira noticed but misread the signs. "You're working yourself to exhaustion," she said one night, her voice holding genuine concern despite their loveless marriage. "Whatever client is demanding this much isn't worth your health." He couldn't tell her the truth, that work was penance, that exhaustion was easier than thinking, that staying busy meant not examining what he'd become. So he just nodded and promised to slow down, another lie added to the growing collection. March 8, 2021, brought a close call that should have ended everything. Amira's birthday dinner at an upscale restaurant. Extended family gathered around a long table. Melissa and Tariq were seated near each other by coincidence, and their familiarity was noticeable to anyone paying attention. The way he passed her water before she asked. How she laughed at his jokes with genuine warmth instead of polite courtesy. Their body language spoke of intimacy that family members shouldn't have. Sheikh Rashid, oblivious and pleased, commented, You two seem friendly. That's good, family should be close. But Amira's eyes narrowed as she watched them. Something in the way they moved around each other, the comfortable synchronization of people who'd spent significant time together, planted the first seed of real suspicion. She said nothing that evening, but she began watching more carefully. By April, small observations accumulated into a pattern. Tariq's phone was always face down. He'd started wearing new cologne, Dior Sauvage, which Amira later remembered Melissa mentioning as her favorite in some casual conversation months earlier. He came home later, citing project deadlines that didn't match his calendar. The emotional distance she'd accepted as normal in their arranged marriage had shifted into something that felt more like avoidance. Meanwhile, Melissa's behavior had changed too. She was happier, which initially seemed positive, but happiness in a loveless marriage raises questions. The household staff noticed new lingerie in her laundry, expensive pieces that Sheikh Rashid, with his conservative preferences, wouldn't have appreciated. She was glued to her phone, smiling at messages that made her blush. Her shopping trips and spa days got longer and less predictable. April 15th, Amira made a decision that would eventually lead 4 people to a yacht and 3 to their deaths. She hired a private investigator. Samir Bashir ran Coastal Investigations Agency, licensed and discreet, specializing in cases exactly like this, wealthy families needing information they couldn't obtain themselves. The retainer was $3,500. Amira paid in cash. "I need to know if my husband is having an affair," she told Samir during their first meeting in his modest office overlooking the marina. "And if he is, I need to know with whom." Samir had handled dozens of infidelity cases. They all started the same way: suspicion, denial, the desperate hope that paranoia was creating patterns where none existed. They usually ended the same way too: photographic evidence that destroyed the illusion but confirmed the truth. Took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks of following Tariq's Tuesday routine, staking out the Sapphire Hotel, documenting arrivals and departures. 2 weeks of tracking a rental car to Crescent Beach Cottage and photographing 2 people who thought they were invisible in their rented isolation. May 3, 2021. Samir delivered his report to Amira in a sealed envelope containing 37 photographs and a written summary. She opened it in her car, parked in an anonymous garage where no one would see her reaction. The photos were undeniable. Tariq and Melissa entering the Sapphire Hotel 15 minutes apart, exiting together 3 hours later, walking hand in hand on Crescent Beach, kissing in a parking garage with the desperate intensity of people stealing moments. Each image was time-stamped, location-stamped, impossible to explain away. Amira sat in her car for 43 minutes, staring at evidence that her husband and her stepmother were betraying both her and her father. She didn't cry. She'd been raised to view emotion as weakness, problems as things to be managed with logic rather than feeling. But sitting in that parking garage, holding photographs of her unraveling family, something cold and sharp crystallized inside her. She drove directly to her lawyer's office, not to file for divorce, that would come later, but to ask a specific question about her father's prenuptial agreement with Melissa. "If my father dies while married to her, what does she inherit?" The lawyer, Abbas Khalil, who drafted the original prenup, pulled up the file. $15 million immediately, plus 20% stake in Al-Malik Holdings. But here's the important clause: any disbursement over $100,000 from that 20% requires your approval as trust manager. She'd be wealthy but not liquid without your authorization. Amira processed this carefully. So even if he died, I'd control her access to the real money. Essentially, yes, the immediate $15 million is hers free and clear. But the $360 million stake? She'd need you to approve any major transactions. Amira thanked him and left. She didn't tell him why she was asking. She didn't tell anyone what she was planning. But driving home, her mind worked through scenarios with the same analytical precision she applied to business problems. She needed more than photos. She needed to know if this affair was just emotional betrayal or something worse. May 15th. She did something that would later become crucial evidence. Using her access to the family's mobile phone account, she was the account holder for both her and Tariq's phones. She requested detailed records. Call logs, text message metadata, data usage patterns. What she found made her blood run cold. 847 text messages between Tariq's number and a number registered to Melissa. Some conversations lasting hours based on the timestamp intervals. patterns showing daily communication during times when both were supposedly occupied with other obligations. The volume alone suggested this wasn't casual family friendliness. This was obsession. But she still couldn't read the content. She needed access to his actual phone. On May 22nd, opportunity presented itself in the most mundane way possible. Tariq left his phone on the kitchen counter while showering. He'd disabled the passcode months ago, arrogance born from assuming trust in a marriage where trust had died long before the affair started. Amira had 14 minutes. She didn't just read the messages. She forwarded the entire conversation thread to her own phone, then deleted the forwarded messages from his sent folder. She worked with surgical precision, hands steady despite her racing heart, documenting evidence that would eventually explain everything. What she found was worse than physical betrayal. Much worse. The texts revealed a conspiracy. May 22nd exchange, Melissa to Tariq. What if there was a way? A real way? June 10th. We have a problem. Your wife controls the money even after he's gone. Tariq's response. So we need to deal with her too. Amira stood in her kitchen, reading messages planning her father's murder and her own, and made a decision that sealed all their fates. She didn't call the police, didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she began her own preparation, buying a small recording device disguised as a necklace for $380 from Discreet Tech Solutions. Water-resistant, 6-hour recording capacity, her insurance policy for whatever came next. October 22nd, 2023, began like any other day in the lives of 4 people who had no idea they wouldn't survive it. Melissa woke at 6:30 a.m. in the penthouse, the morning light streaming across marble floors that still felt foreign after 3 years of marriage. Sheikh Rafiq was already preparing for work, humming quietly while knotting his tie, a man content with his life, oblivious to the conspiracy being plotted by his wife and son-in-law. Tonight will be special, he said, bringing her coffee in bed, a gesture he still performed despite having staff who could do it. Family time on the yacht. I've been looking forward to this all week. Melissa forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. Me too. But her phone was already buzzing with a text from Tariq, sent at 6:47 a.m. Are you ready? She typed back with trembling fingers. No. But we don't have a choice anymore. The truth was they'd had a choice at every single step. The affair was a choice. The conspiracy was a choice. Boarding the yacht that evening was a choice. But they'd made so many small choices leading to this moment that turning back felt impossible, like they were caught in momentum that existed independent of their will. Across the city, in the townhouse she shared with Tariq, Amira was making breakfast, something she rarely did, usually leaving it to staff. But this morning required the illusion of normalcy, even as her recording device necklace sat on the bathroom counter, fully charged and ready. You're cooking? Tariq asked, wandering into the kitchen with the exhausted look of someone who hadn't slept well in months. Felt like it, Amira said carefully. Last breakfast before our evening cruise. The way she emphasized last made him look up sharply. Their eyes met across the kitchen island, and in that moment, a terrible understanding passed between them. She knew. He knew she knew. Neither acknowledged it because acknowledging it would force action, and they were both trapped in the script of this final day. What time should we head to the marina? Tariq asked, his voice falsely casual. 5:30. Father wants to depart at 6 sharp. Amira slid eggs onto a plate. Melissa will be there too, of course. Isn't that nice? The whole family together. The eggs tasted like ash in Tariq's mouth, but he ate them anyway, performing normalcy until it was time to perform tragedy. By 11 a.m., Melissa sent Tariq a text that revealed her growing panic. She knows. How do you know? He typed back. I can feel it. The way she looked at me at dinner last night. We should cancel. On what grounds? Tariq's response came quickly. We just confirm suspicion. We go through with it. If she knows, we improvise. Improvise murder? Melissa's fingers shook typing the words. We're already improvising everything. Neither of them considered the most obvious option. Confessing, accepting consequences, choosing lives over freedom. They'd crossed too many lines to see the exits anymore. The affair had been line 1. Planning the murder was line 2. Every conversation after that had been line 3, 4, 5, until they stood on the far side of morality looking back at normalcy like it was another country. At 2 p.m., the marina was preparing Desert Rose for the evening cruise. Captain Yusuf Abdul, 52 years old and veteran of hundreds of luxury yacht trips, performed his routine safety checks. Fuel tank full. Life vests accessible. Emergency beacon functional. Weather forecast clear, 78 degrees. Calm seas, perfect conditions for family evening. He had no idea he'd be the only witness to what was coming. No idea that by morning he'd be giving statements to police trying to reconstruct how luxury became carnage in the span of 90 minutes. By 5:45 p.m., everyone was arriving. Sheikh Rafiq came first, driven by his personal driver Omar, wearing traditional white dishdasha and carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon 2008 that cost $1,200. For celebrating family, he told Captain Youssef, his mood genuinely joyful. Melissa arrived next, driven by Layla. She wore a white linen dress that she'd agonized over that morning, changing 4 times before settling on something that felt like armor masquerading as elegance. Hidden in her purse was her phone set to voice memo record, and something else, a small folding knife she'd purchased 2 days earlier, telling herself it was just precaution but knowing it was preparation for violence. Tariq and Amira arrived together at 5:52 p.m., their car ride over in tense silence. Amira wore her recording device necklace, the small digital recorder disguised as jewelry capturing every sound. Tariq noticed it but said nothing, his mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating outcomes and contingencies like this was a problem he could solve through architecture, measuring spaces and angles and structural integrity. At exactly 6 p.m., Desert Rose pulled away from the marina. For people on board, Captain Youssef at the helm, the evening sun painting everything gold. To anyone watching from shore, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a wealthy family enjoying their privilege. The first hour passed in excruciating false normalcy. They sat on the main deck, champagne poured for everyone except Melissa, who claimed a headache and took sparkling water instead. Sheikh Rafiq toasted to family unity, completely unaware he was toasting with the people planning his death. "This is what matters," he said, his voice warm with genuine emotion. "Not business, not money. Family together." Melissa's smile felt painted on. Tariq couldn't meet anyone's eyes, and Amira watched them both with the cold precision of someone who'd moved past emotion into calculation. At 7:14 p.m., Amira made her move. She stood slowly, her champagne glass catching the dying light. "Father, I need to tell you something about your wife and my husband." The air went electric. Sheikh Rafiq looked confused. Melissa's face drained of color. Tariq's hand tightened on his glass hard enough that his knuckles went white. "What are you talking about?" Sheikh Rafiq asked, genuinely puzzled. "They've been having an affair." Amira's voice was steady, clinical, like she was presenting a business report. "For over a year." The words landed like physical blows. Melissa immediately tried to deny it. "That's insane, Amira. Why would you?" But Tariq cut her off with 4 words that ended the pretense. "Amira, don't do this. Not, that's not true. Not, she's lying. Just don't do this," which was confession and plea simultaneously. Sheikh Rafiq stood slowly, his hand moving to his chest in a gesture that would become significant. "Amira, this is serious accusation. You have proof." Amira pulled out her phone. "I have 847 text messages between them. I have private investigator photos. I have hotel receipts, credit card statements, everything." She handed her father the phone. He took it with shaking hands and began scrolling through messages that documented his wife's betrayal in explicit detail. The silence stretched for 43 seconds while he read, seconds that felt like hours while everyone watched his face transform from confusion to comprehension to devastation. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Melissa first. "You've been sleeping with my daughter's husband." Not a question. A statement heavy with pain that went beyond anger into something more fundamental, the destruction of trust that had anchored his world. Melissa tried to explain, words tumbling out in panic justification. "Rashid, please, let me explain. The prenup trapped me. I felt isolated. I never meant." "Explain." His voice cracked with raw emotion. "You've been sleeping with my daughter's husband. You planned this whole evening, this family time." He stopped, hand gripping his chest tighter, breathing becoming labored. Tariq stood abruptly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it did." Amira's voice cut through like a blade. "And it got worse." Everyone froze. Tariq's face went pale. Melissa's eyes went wide. "Sheikh Rashid, still struggling to process the affair, looked at his daughter with confused dread. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. Amira pulled up specific messages on her phone and began reading aloud. June 10th, Melissa to Tariq. "We have a problem. Your wife controls the money even after he's gone." Tariq's response, "So we need to deal with her too." August 15th, Yacht. Family evening, October. "I'll make sure he's stressed beforehand." She looked up from the phone, her eyes moving between Melissa and Tariq. "You planned this evening. You planned to kill us both." The world seemed to stop. Even the ocean waves sounded distant, muffled, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Sheikh Rashid's face went from red to gray in seconds, his breathing rapid and shallow, hand clutching his chest with increasing desperation. You were going to kill me?" His voice barely whisper. "I gave you everything. I welcomed you as son." He looked between them, betrayal giving way to something worse, heartbreak that manifested physically. Melissa dropped to her knees, words pouring out in desperate torrents. The prenup trapped me. I couldn't leave with nothing. I gave up everything for you. I just wanted to be free. So you decided I should die for your freedom?" Sheikh Rafiq staggered backward, his heart condition, already fragile, unable to withstand the catastrophic stress. Tariq tried to justify, his voice breaking. "You don't understand what it's like, being trapped in a marriage that's a contract, not a commitment. Amira, you never loved me. You never even tried. So you decided we should die?" Amira's voice was ice. "Father has a heart condition. Stress could kill him. And you're using that. You're monsters." At 7:23 p.m., Sheikh Rafiq collapsed. His hand released from his chest and reached out blindly, his body crumpling to the deck like a marionette with cut strings. The theoretical had become horrifyingly real. The heart attack they'd planned to induce was happening, triggered by the emotional devastation of discovering the plot. Everything that came after was chaos layered on chaos, violence spiraling beyond anyone's control, proving that murder might be planned but never controlled, that four people who thought they were smart enough to orchestrate tragedy were actually just human enough to create it by accident. Sheikh Rafiq hit the deck hard, the sound of his body collapsing cutting through the evening air like a gunshot. For a frozen moment, everyone stared at him. This man who'd been standing seconds ago, now crumpled and gasping, his face turning an alarming shade of gray-blue. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak, but only a strangled wheeze emerged. Melissa screamed his name, the sound raw and primal, and ran to him. Despite everything, despite the affair, despite the conspiracy, despite having spent months planning his death, faced with the actual reality of him dying, she was genuinely terrified. "Rashid! No, no, no!" She dropped beside him, hands hovering uselessly over his body, not knowing what to do. Tariq stood frozen, paralyzed between horror and the terrible realization that this was exactly what they'd wanted. Just not like this, not with witnesses, not with Amira knowing everything. His hands shook at his sides, his breath coming in short gasps that matched the dying man on the deck. But Amira moved with purpose. She'd taken first aid courses as part of her business training, corporate requirement that now became the difference between doing something and doing nothing. She pushed past Melissa, dropped to her knees beside her father, and immediately checked for a pulse. Weak, thready. His breathing was shallow and labored. "Captain Youssef," she shouted toward the bridge. "Medical emergency. Radio for help now." The captain appeared within seconds, took one look at the scene, and grabbed his radio. "Coast Guard, this is Desert Rose. We have medical emergency, heart attack, need immediate evacuation, coordinates." His voice faded as he rattled off their position, professional training overriding the shock of what he was witnessing. Amira began CPR, her hands positioned over her father's chest, counting compressions with mechanical precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythm of trying to restart a heart that had been broken by betrayal before it failed from disease. "His medication," she barked at Melissa. "Where's his emergency medication?" Melissa scrambled up, her white dress already stained with seawater from the deck, and ran toward the yacht's cabin where Sheikh Rafiq kept his travel bag. Her hands were shaking so violently that when she grabbed the pill bottle of nitroglycerin, it slipped from her fingers and hit the deck. Pills scattered everywhere, tiny white tablets rolling into corners and crevices. "Fuck, fuck, fuck." Melissa dropped to her hands and knees, gathering pills with fumbling fingers, her carefully maintained composure shattered completely. Back on the main deck, Sheikh Rafiq had a brief moment of consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, found Melissa's face as she returned with the medication, and his hand reached out weakly to grip her wrist. The look in his eyes was worse than anger. It was profound sadness, the grief of a man who'd trusted completely and been betrayed absolutely. You were going to... He couldn't finish the sentence. His grip loosened. His eyes rolled back. Stay with me. Amira continued compressions, her voice cracking for the first time. Father, stay with me. Captain Youssef returned from the bridge. Helicopter is 17 minutes out. I've updated them on his condition. 17 minutes. Felt like 17 hours. Amira kept doing compressions, her arms burning, sweat dripping down her face despite the cool evening air. Melissa tried to get a nitroglycerin pill under Sheikh Rashid's tongue, but he was too far gone to swallow, the pill just dissolving uselessly in his unresponsive mouth. And Tariq stood apart from all of it, watching the scene unfold with growing horror. This was the plan. They'd wanted him to have a heart attack, but actually seeing it happen, watching Amira desperately try to save her father while knowing he and Melissa had caused this, the reality was nothing like the sanitized version they'd imagined during their planning sessions in hotel rooms. At 7:31 p.m., 8 minutes into the medical emergency, Tariq made a choice that would cost him his life. His mind, spiraling through panic and calculation, reached a terrible conclusion. If Sheikh Rafiq survived, he and Melissa would go to prison. Amira had evidence, recordings, messages, everything. The only way out was to ensure the heart attack was fatal, to finish what they'd started. He looked around the deck, his architect's eye assessing tools and weapons from objects not designed as either. His gaze landed on the champagne bottle sitting on the table, expensive Dom Perignon that had toasted to family an hour earlier. He picked it up. The weight felt substantial in his hand. Melissa saw him first. Tariq, what are you? Time seemed to fracture. Amira, still doing compressions on her father, looked up and understood immediately. Her husband was holding a bottle like a weapon, advancing toward her dying father, preparing to ensure the job was finished. The affair had been betrayal. The conspiracy had been evil. But this was murder in real time, and she was watching it happen. Don't. Her voice was steel wrapped in warning. She stopped CPR and stood slowly, positioning herself between Tariq and Sheikh Rashid. Tariq, don't do this. I can't go to prison. His voice was barely recognizable, high and strained. I can't. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. So you're going to kill him? Amira's hands balled into fists. While I watch. While the captain watches. How exactly do you think that ends? It ends with him dead and us figuring out the rest. Tariq was shouting now, rationality completely abandoned. You have evidence that destroys us. If he survives, we're finished. Captain Youssef stepped forward. Sir, put down the bottle. Coast Guard is coming. Don't make this worse. But Tariq was beyond reasoning. He lunged forward, bottle raised. Amira moved to intercept. They collided hard, both stumbling. The bottle swung wildly, missed Amira, but smashed against the yacht's railing. Glass exploded everywhere, leaving Tariq holding a jagged bottleneck that had transformed from blunt object to edged weapon. Melissa was screaming. Captain Youssef was radioing for additional help, not just medical now but police. And on the deck, Sheikh Rafiq lay dying while his family fought around him, his last moments surrounded by violence born from love, twisted into something unrecognizable. Amira tackled Tariq properly this time, her smaller frame driven by desperation. They crashed to the deck, rolling the broken bottle between them. She was trying to disarm him. He was trying to push her away, to get to her father, to finish what the heart attack had started. I'm recording everything, Amira gasped out during the struggle. Hidden device. Every word, every confession. You're finished regardless. She pointed to her necklace, the small recorder disguised as jewelry. And that revelation, that proof of their conspiracy existed independent of whether anyone survived, made Tariq's panic absolute. Give me that. He grabbed for the necklace. They were too close to the railing now, their struggle taking them toward the edge of the yacht, 6 feet down to dark water. Amira was pulling back, trying to maintain balance. Tariq was grabbing for the recording device, for evidence that would destroy him. That's when Melissa made her choice. While they fought, She'd been frozen, watching chaos unfold around her dying husband. But seeing Tariq and Amira near the railing, seeing the broken bottle, seeing her entire future collapsing into violence and consequences, something in her broke or crystallized. It was impossible to say which. She ran to the yacht's cabin. Sheikh Rafiq kept a gun there, small pistol, .38 caliber, protection against the unlikely event of piracy. She'd seen it months ago while unpacking his luggage, noted its location the way she'd noted everything about her new life, cataloging information without knowing if it would ever matter. Now it mattered. She grabbed the gun with shaking hands, checked that it was loaded with knowledge gained from American childhood around firearms, and returned to the deck. The weight of it felt impossible, not heavy, but significant in a way that transcended physics. This was the moment, the absolute point of no return. Everything before could theoretically be walked back, explained, defended. But once she fired this gun, there was only forward into whatever consequences followed. Everyone stop. Her voice cut through the struggle. Tariq and Amira froze, still tangled near the railing. Captain Youssef turned from his radio, his face going pale. And on the deck, Sheikh Rafiq lay silent and still, his chest no longer rising with even shallow breaths. Melissa held the gun in both hands, pointing it at nothing and everything simultaneously. I didn't want this. I just wanted to be free. Melissa, put the gun down. Amira's voice was careful, measured, the tone you'd use with someone on a ledge. I can't go to prison. I won't. Melissa's finger was on the trigger, her aim wavering between Tariq and Amira, unable to decide which represented greater threat or greater betrayal. Tariq stepped away from Amira, his hands raised, broken bottle still gripped in one. We can still fix this. We can fix this. Melissa laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Your father-in-law is dying or dead on the deck. Your wife has recordings of U.S. planning murder. The Coast Guard is coming. What part of this is fixable? Time crystallized into impossible choice. Amira had evidence that would destroy them both. Tariq was the reason she was in this position, the affair that had evolved into conspiracy. Sheikh Rafiq was dying from stress they'd caused. And Melissa, holding a gun she'd never imagined firing at another human, had seconds to decide what survival looked like. She pointed the gun at Tariq. I'm sorry, she whispered, and fired. The sound was enormous in the open air, a crack that echoed across water. Tariq's eyes went wide with shock and pain as the bullet caught him in the upper chest, just below his collarbone. He staggered backward, hand moving to the wound, blood spreading across his shirt in a bloom that looked black in the evening light. You shot me. His voice was disbelief more than pain, like he couldn't process that this was happening, that Melissa had actually pulled the trigger. His backward momentum carried him into the railing. For a frozen moment, he teetered there, balance lost, the yacht's movement on the waves adding to his instability. Then gravity and physics took over. He went backward over the railing, still holding the broken bottle, his expression shocked as he fell. The impact of his head on the yacht's lower railing on the way down made a sound that nobody on deck would ever forget. A wet crack that meant skull fracture, brain injury, death arriving before the water even touched him. He hit the ocean 6 feet below, floated face down for 3 seconds, then began sinking as his lungs filled with water. Captain Youssef was already throwing a life preserver, already radioing the Coast Guard with updates. Man overboard, gunshot wound, head injury, need immediate assistance. But everyone on deck knew it was too late. Tariq Al-Mansouri was dead or dying, and the affair that had seemed like salvation had ended with him in dark water, bleeding and drowning simultaneously. At 7:36 p.m., 8 minutes after his father-in-law's heart attack, 13 minutes after Amira revealed the conspiracy, Tariq died. The medical examiner would later determine that either the gunshot wound or the head injury could have been independently fatal. Combined with drowning, he had no chance. He sank slowly into water that would hold his body until the Coast Guard recovered it 90 minutes later. On the deck of Desert Rose, Melissa still held the gun, her hands shaking so violently the weapon looked alive. She'd just killed a man. The reality of it was trying to penetrate her shock but couldn't quite make it through. Amira stared at her stepmother, processing that Melissa had shot her husband. Despite their loveless marriage, despite his betrayal, Tariq was still someone she'd lived with for 5 years, someone she trusted even if she hadn't loved. And now he was in the water, dead or dying, because of a conspiracy he and Melissa had created together. You killed him. Amira's voice was flat, emotionless, the shock too great for feeling. He was going to kill your father. Kill you. I had to. Melissa's justification sounded hollow even to her own ears. You planned to kill us first. Amira's control shattered. You don't get to claim self-defense when you started this. You're the reason we're here. You and your greed and your affair and your stupid, evil plan. She advanced toward Melissa, fury finally breaking through calculation. Behind them, Sheikh Rafiq lay motionless, the CPR long stopped, his chest no longer moving. He'd been dead for 6 minutes, though nobody had officially acknowledged it yet. His heart, weakened by years of condition and destroyed by ultimate betrayal, had failed at 7:30 p.m. while his family killed each other around him. Give me the gun. Amira held out her hand. Stay away from me. Melissa backed up, weapon still pointed. You're going to prison for life. You shot my husband. There are witnesses. Give me the gun and maybe you survive this. But Melissa's mind was doing its own terrible math. Amira had the recording device with all their incriminating conversations. Captain Youssef had witnessed her shooting Tariq. Sheikh Rafiq was dead from stress they'd caused. Even if she claimed self-defense, even if she argued justification, the underlying conspiracy would come out. She'd spend the rest of her life in prison. Not the metaphorical prison of a prenup, but actual bars and cells and decades of consequence. Unless there were no witnesses, unless the recording device disappeared, unless the evidence went overboard along with the people who could testify. The thought was insane. She'd already crossed into murder once. Crossing again felt both impossible and inevitable, like she was sliding down a slope where stopping meant falling anyway. The recording, Melissa said quietly. Give me the recording. Absolutely not. Amira, please. Give me the recording and I'll turn myself in. I swear. I need to destroy it first. So you can claim this was all self-defense? Amira's laugh was bitter. You planned to murder my father and me. That recording is the only proof of what you really are. They were both moving now, circling each other like fighters in a ring. Melissa with the gun, Amira with evidence, both understanding that only one of them could leave this yacht with their future intact. Captain Youssef tried to intervene. Ladies, please, the Coast Guard is 4 minutes out. Put down the weapon and let the authorities. Neither listened. They were beyond authority now, beyond rationality, beyond anything except the animal drive to survive regardless of cost. Melissa fired the gun again. Not at Amira. She wasn't aiming, just trying to scare her back, to create space. But the bullet went wild, ricocheted off the railing, and the sound made everyone flinch. In that moment of distraction, Amira lunged forward. They collided hard, both grappling for the gun. Melissa was taller, but Amira was driven by fury and righteousness. They stumbled across the deck, knocking over the champagne glasses that had toasted to family, stepping around Sheikh Rashid's body, their struggle taking them closer to where Tariq had gone over. The gun was between them, both hands on it, both pulling. Melissa's finger was still on the trigger. The weapon discharged a third time, the bullet going straight up into empty air, the muzzle flash bright in the descending darkness. Then they were at the railing. The same railing Tariq had gone over. The momentum of their struggle carried them forward. Amira's back hit the railing first, Melissa pushing forward with the gun, both of them breathing hard, faces inches apart. Let go! Melissa screamed. You let go! Amira screamed back. Neither let go. They hung there, balanced on the edge, the gun between them, their combined weight making the railing creak ominously. Below them, dark water where Tariq's body floated somewhere in the depths. Captain Youssef ran toward them, his wounded arm leaving a trail of blood he'd received trying to break up the earlier fight. Don't, both of you stop. He grabbed Melissa's arm, trying to pull her back from the edge. His grip was strong despite his injury, yanking her away from the railing. Melissa held onto the gun. Amira was still holding the gun too, their hands tangled together on the weapon. The physics were simple and terrible. Captain Youssef's pull on Melissa created momentum backward, but Amira was still attached via the gun, her body weight suddenly unsupported as Melissa was yanked away. The railing that had been supporting her back was suddenly not there. Time slowed the way it does in moments of catastrophe. Amira felt herself going over, felt gravity taking her, felt the gun slipping from her hands. She made a choice in that instant. Keep holding the gun and definitely fall, or release it and maybe not. She released it, but her momentum was already committed. She went over the railing backward, arms windmilling, a scream torn from her throat. The recording device necklace that she'd worn to document the truth, the waterproof device that was supposed to preserve evidence, caught the light as she fell. She hit the water cleanly, 6 feet down, the impact shocking cold despite the warm evening. She surfaced immediately, gasping, treading water. "Life preserver," she shouted up at the yacht. "Throw the life preserver." Captain Youssef, still gripping Melissa, grabbed the preserver with his free hand and threw it. But his aim was off, his wound and his grip on Melissa making his throw weak. The preserver landed 8 feet short, the current immediately starting to carry it away from Amira. Amira began swimming toward it, strong strokes that showed she'd grown up on the coast, comfortable in water. She could make it. She was a good swimmer. 8 feet was nothing. But the recording device around her neck, the necklace that had been advertised as waterproof, was heavier than expected. Water was seeping into it faster than the manufacturer had promised, the electronics inside absorbing water and weight. What had been a light necklace was becoming an anchor. Amira felt it immediately, the drag, the pull, the way her head was sinking lower in the water with each stroke. She reached up to unclasp it, to remove the device before it dragged her down. But the clasp was tangled in her hair, the chain not breaking despite her yanking. "It's stuck," she screamed toward the yacht. "The necklace is stuck." On the deck, Captain Youssef made the split-second decision that would haunt him. He could hold Melissa, who still had the gun and had already shot one person. Or he could dive in after Amira, leaving a potentially homicidal woman on his yacht. He chose the immediate threat. He released Melissa and dove into the water. But in the 10 seconds it took him to jump and surface and orient himself, Amira had been pulled under by the recording device. She'd fought it, clawing at the chain, trying to break it or unsnap it or tear it from her neck. The last thing the recording captured before water shorted it completely was her voice, desperate and fading. "The truth is," then nothing but the sound of water. Captain Youssef dove under, searching in dark water lit only by the yacht's lights. He found her 12 feet down, still struggling with the necklace, her movements getting weaker. He grabbed her, tried to pull her up, but the recording device was too heavy, and she'd breathed water and panic was making her fight him. They broke the surface together 30 seconds later. Amira coughed, vomited seawater, her face pale. "Can't breathe. I have you," Captain Youssef gasped, pulling her toward the preserver. "Hold on. Coast Guard is almost here." But Amira's struggling had weakened. Her eyes were rolling back. The water she'd breathed in was filling her lungs, drowning her from the inside even though her face was above the surface. Her hands slipped from the captain's grip once, twice. The third time he couldn't catch her. Amira Al-Malik sank for the final time at 7:42 p.m., the recording device that she'd worn to document truth taking her down with it. The Coast Guard recovered her body 47 minutes later, the necklace still around her neck, the recording partially intact but cut off at the crucial moment, her final words about truth left unfinished. On the deck of Desert Rose, Melissa stood alone with a gun, with 3 bodies in various states of recovery, with the certain knowledge that the Coast Guard helicopter she could hear approaching would bring police and questions and consequences. She looked at the gun in her hands, looked at Sheikh Rashid's body, looked at the dark water where Tariq and Amira had both disappeared. She'd wanted freedom. She'd wanted to escape the prenup, the isolation, the golden cage. Instead, she'd created a bloodbath that killed everyone she'd conspired with and against. Her arm was bleeding heavily from the laceration she'd received during the earlier struggle, a deep cut from broken glass that had gone unnoticed in the chaos. Blood dripped onto the pristine white deck, mixing with seawater, creating pools that looked black in the helicopter's approaching searchlights. Melissa dropped the gun. It clattered on the deck beside Sheikh Rashid's body. She slid down against the cabin wall and sat there, covered in blood, some hers, some from the man she'd married, and waited for rescue that felt more like capture. At 8:15 p.m., the Coast Guard helicopter lowered a paramedic onto the yacht's deck. By 8:27 p.m., Melissa was being airlifted to Royal Medical Center, her blood pressure dropping, her consciousness fading, her body giving up even as the doctors fought to save it. Sheikh Rashid, Tariq, and Amira were already dead. Melissa Harper would join them 3 hours later in an operating room where no amount of blood transfusions or cardiac resuscitation could overcome the combined trauma of severed artery, ruptured organs, and a will to live that had been extinguished somewhere between firing the first shot and watching the third body sink beneath dark water. October 23, 2023, 4:17 a.m. The automated distress beacon brings the story full circle. Coast Guard responding to the silent yacht. The discovery of bodies. The beginning of the investigation that would piece together how 4 people who'd woken up that morning ended the day dead. Detective Nadia Karim of the Al-Zahara Police Department caught the case at 6 a.m., arriving at the marina with 18 years of homicide experience and the immediate sense that this wasn't going to be straightforward. 3 bodies recovered from the water, 1 dead at the hospital, a yacht that looked like a war zone, and a shell-shocked captain giving a statement that sounded like it came from a movie rather than real life. They were planning to kill him and his daughter, Captain Youssef said in the interview room, his wounded arm bandaged, his eyes haunted. The daughter found out. She confronted them on the yacht. Then everything just exploded. The father's heart gave out from the stress. The son-in-law tried to finish him off, so the stepmother shot him. He went overboard. Then the daughter and stepmother fought, and the daughter went over too, drowned because her recording necklace pulled her down. The stepmother was bleeding out on deck when I pulled the daughter from the water. He paused, his voice breaking. I couldn't save any of them. I tried, but I couldn't save any of them. The forensic evidence supported his account in excruciating detail. The yacht security camera, running on a 2-hour loop, captured everything from 6 to 8 p.m. Melissa's phone, found in her purse, had been recording on voice memo, 90 minutes of audio that included the confrontation, the confessions, the gunshot, the violence. Amira's recording device, recovered with her body, was water-damaged but 40% salvageable, enough to capture the conspiracy texts being read aloud, enough to establish premeditation. But the most damning evidence came from the text messages themselves. 847 messages between Melissa and Tariq, retrieved from phone company records and Amira's device where she'd forwarded them. The evolution from affair to conspiracy documented in their own words, impossible to deny or explain away. Detective Karim sat in her office on October 25th, reading through the messages for the 3rd time, trying to understand how 2 people who weren't inherently evil had talked themselves into murder. The early messages were almost sympathetic, 2 lonely people finding connection, sharing their unhappiness, building emotional intimacy. But somewhere around May 2021, the tone shifted. Complaint became conspiracy. What if became how to. Fantasy became plan. May 22nd exchange. Melissa, what if there was a way? A real way? The question that started everything. June 10th, when they realized Amira controlled the inheritance. So we need to deal with her too. The moment when 1 murder became 2, when they crossed from desperate to monstrous. August 15th, when they finalized the yacht plan. I'll make sure he's stressed beforehand. You make sure Amira is there. They'd planned everything except Amira discovering the plot. They'd calculated murder but not the chaos that follows violence. They'd believed they were smart enough to control the outcome, when really they were just reckless enough to set catastrophe in motion. The medical examiner's reports added clinical detail to the tragedy. Sheikh Rafiq Al-Malik died of acute myocardial infarction at 7:30 p.m., his heart unable to withstand the combined stress of his condition and the emotional trauma of discovered betrayal. Tariq Al-Mansouri died from either gunshot wound to the chest or blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner couldn't determine which was immediately fatal, though drowning finished what the other injuries started. Time of death, approximately 7:36 p.m. Amira Al-Malik drowned at 7:42 p.m., the recording device acting as anchor, pulling her down despite her swimming ability. The partial recording recovered from the device captured her final words, "The truth is," then just water sounds and electrical failure. What truth she'd meant to articulate died with her. Melissa Harper, legally Melissa Al-Malik, though the family would fight to remove that name posthumously, died at 10:17 p.m. in Operating Room 3 of Royal Medical Center. Cause of death, cardiac arrest due to hypovolemic shock and multi-organ failure. Contributing factors, severed radial artery, ruptured spleen, massive blood loss. She'd survived the yacht, survived the helicopter ride, survived the initial surgery, but her body, weakened by trauma and blood loss, simply gave up. Dr. Layla Hassan, the trauma surgeon who tried to save her, Noted in the medical record, patient expressed guilt and remorse during brief lucid moments before surgery. Last coherent words, "I just wanted to be free." Tragedy all around. By October 30th, Detective Karim had enough evidence to close the case even though all suspects were deceased. Her final report laid out the sequence with clinical precision. Melissa Harper and Tariq Al-Mansouri engaged in extramarital affair beginning January 2021. Over months, affair evolved into conspiracy to murder Sheikh Rafiq Al-Malik for inheritance and Amira Al-Malik for financial control. Amira discovered plot through surveillance and confronted conspirators on October 22nd. Emotional revelation triggered Sheikh Rashid's fatal heart attack. Subsequent violence resulted in Tariq's homicide, Amira's accidental death, and Melissa's trauma-induced death. Charges if anyone had survived: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, manslaughter. But justice in any legal sense was impossible. The guilty had died alongside the innocent. The only verdict was the one delivered by chaos and consequence. The families dealt with aftermath in their own ways. Sheikh Rashid's brother Khalid took control of Al-Malik Holdings, steering the company through scandal with grim determination. The estate, worth $1.8 billion, went to extended family and charitable foundations. Melissa's prenup was voided due to the conspiracy. She died exactly as she'd feared, with nothing. Amira was remembered through a scholarship foundation that bore her name, $50,000 awarded annually to 10 women pursuing business degrees. Her recording device, the necklace that had documented truth and caused death simultaneously, was donated to the police academy as training equipment, a reminder that evidence collection sometimes carries unexpected cost. Tariq's family, the Al-Mansouris, moved away from Al-Zahara, unable to bear the social shame. His father Ahmed suffered a stroke in 2024, stress-induced, another casualty of the Yacht's violence even though he'd been nowhere near it. They never spoke publicly about their son, the arranged marriage, or the desperation that had driven him to conspiracy. And Melissa's mother, Patricia Harper, flew to Al-Zahara to claim her daughter's body, given the investigation files, and returned to Riverside Heights carrying grief and guilt in equal measure. At a press conference on November 5th, she said, "My daughter made terrible, unforgivable choices, but she wasn't born evil. She was desperate. That doesn't excuse conspiracy to murder. But maybe it explains how a smart woman became someone I don't recognize." To the Al-Malik family, I am profoundly sorry. Patricia died in 2029, heart disease that doctors said was partly genetic and partly stress. She never remarried, never recovered from the shame of her daughter's actions. Her funeral was attended by 8 people. The true crime coverage was inevitable and extensive. Podcasts dissected every text message. Documentaries interviewed investigators, family members, anyone with peripheral connection to the case. The story had everything media loved: wealth, beauty, betrayal, violence, moral complexity. It became shorthand for how greed disguised as need could corrupt ordinary people into monsters. But the most insightful analysis came from Dr. Yasmin Tariq, a forensic psychologist who'd worked with the investigation. In an interview for a 2025 documentary, she said, "People always ask if Melissa and Tariq were sociopaths, if they lacked empathy or moral compass. The answer is no. They weren't monsters. They were humans who made a series of choices, each one slightly worse than the last, until they traveled so far from their own values they couldn't see the way back. The affair was choice 1, betraying trust for emotional comfort. Planning the murder was choice 2, prioritizing freedom over human life. Getting on that yacht was choice 3, committing to action rather than confession. At any point they could have stopped, confessed, accepted consequences, chosen prison over violence. But they didn't, because humans are remarkably good at justifying their choices, especially when those choices serve their immediate interests. The tragedy isn't that bad people did bad things. The tragedy is that ordinary people, faced with ordinary problems, unhappy marriages, financial constraints, cultural isolation, chose extraordinary evil as their solution. And violence, once initiated, has its own momentum. They thought they were in control. They were wrong. Violence controlled them, and it killed them all. The case became cautionary tale in multiple disciplines. Law schools taught it as example of how prenuptial agreements can create perverse incentives. Psychology programs used it to illustrate moral disengagement and incremental escalation. Business ethics courses examined the dangers of transactional relationships. And in Al-Zahara itself, the story became whispered warning about the hidden costs of arranged marriages and the isolation of cross-cultural unions without proper support. Years later, people would debate who deserved sympathy in the story. Sheikh Rashid, certainly, a man guilty only of trusting badly and dying from heartbreak. Amira, who tried to protect her father and died for it, though some argued her choice to confront rather than involve police was its own kind of pride-driven error. Tariq and Melissa received less sympathy, though even they had defenders who pointed to arranged marriage, prenuptial entrapment, and the desperate choices people make when they feel suffocated by circumstances they can't escape. The truth, as always, was more complex than any single narrative could capture. 4 people died on October 22, 2023. 1 was innocent. 3 were guilty of varying degrees of betrayal and conspiracy. But even the guilty had started as ordinary people making understandable decisions, marrying for security, seeking connection, wanting escape from unhappiness. It was the accumulation of choices, the willingness to consider violence as solution, the belief that they were smarter than consequence, that transformed them from ordinary to monstrous. The Desert Rose was sold in 2024, purchased by a different wealthy family who didn't care about or perhaps didn't know its history. It sails the same waters where 3 people died, carrying new families who toast to new bonds, unaware that the deck they stand on once ran with blood from people who'd also loved and planned and believed they deserved happiness. The last word belongs to Captain Youssef Abdul, who survived but carries the weight of that evening in every nightmare and waking moment. In his statement to police, he said, "I've been on the water 30 years. I've seen storms, accidents, mechanical failures, but I've never seen anything like that night. They destroyed each other. Not because they were evil, but because they confused wanting something with deserving it, confused unhappiness with justification, confused desire with right. And by the time they understood what they'd unleashed, it was too late. Violence doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care if you're a good person who made bad choices. It just consumes everything, including the people who started it. 4 people boarded a yacht on a perfect October evening. 0 survived. The prenup that was supposed to protect became the motive for murder. The affair that was supposed to bring happiness brought death. The confrontation that was supposed to reveal truth revealed only how quickly civilization collapses when people believe their needs justify any action. In the end, Melissa got her freedom. She died free of the prenup, free of the marriage, free of the cultural isolation. She just didn't live to enjoy it. Tariq escaped his arranged marriage and family obligations. He just escaped into dark water that filled his lungs and stopped his heart. Amira preserved the truth with her recording. She just drowned under the weight of it. And Sheikh Rashid, who'd wanted nothing more than family and companionship, died surrounded by the people who were supposed to love him, learning in his final moments that they'd planned his death instead. The lesson, if there is one, isn't about prenups or affairs or arranged marriages or cultural differences. It's simpler and darker. Desperation makes us believe we're capable of things we'd condemn in others. Greed convinces us we're entitled to what we want. And violence, once we give it permission to solve our problems, kills indiscriminately. The guilty and the innocent, the planners and the victims, until everyone is just a body being pulled from dark water at dawn.